Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining me for Doing Better Research for Marketers, or in other words, just do it better. Today, we're going to talk about ways to design experiments, common pitfalls to fall into, and some less obvious things that most marketers don't know about research. I'm coming to you from the sauna of my office, so please bear with me if there are some technical difficulties. But first and foremost, you're never going to get it right on the first go. It's the whole point of experiments. Marketing is all about experimentation, just something of a cliche at this point. But how many marketers really know what it takes to design a great experiment? Plenty seem to. It's pretty straightforward, but there are some things to know about designing experiments that are less common that can really help you level up your data and really help you design better experiments that will drive better insights and thus ideally more revenue. There are some obvious points. Who cares about them? We'll dive into them a little bit, and then we're going to go deep into some less common topics. These are lessons that I have gained from almost a decade in academia. I used to work in education research. I have a few published studies to my name and plenty of marketing experience or experiments that I have run. So I wanted to share some of these lessons that I've learned with you all. First and foremost, let's talk about academic rigor. When we think about academia, this is very prevalent. Your studies need to be well designed, they need to be thought through, or you are going to get revised and resubmitted into oblivion. Your decisions should not be based on whimsy, but cold, hard facts, and you need to apply some logic. So these are common questions to look at for academic rigor. There's obviously many more. But this should give you a sense of the kinds of questions you want to ask when you're thinking about a rigorous study. However, we don't necessarily need to do rigorous studies because this isn't academia, this is marketing. Rigor is still important, though not as crucial. Peer review isn't your goal here, it's results, but that doesn't mean that rigor should be ignored. It still matters, there's just a little more flexibility. Academic rigor is one of the most difficult processes, but anybody who's gotten revise and resubmits 3+ times knows what I'm talking about. But for marketing, you still need to answer the above questions. You still need to have a hypothesis, measures, methods, etc. You just have a little more wiggle room with it, and some assumptions are to be expected. You probably won't need to pass journal peer review. That is a very difficult process, but all the same, you should still take care in designing your experiments. Basically, you need more than a gut feeling and a can-do attitude to design real usable studies that will benefit your marketing. So let's talk about the obvious stuff first. At the most basic level, you need these 4 things: hypotheses, measures, method, and sample groups. Ideally, a control and variable group, maybe multiple variable groups, but that's not always possible or necessary. However, first things first, let's dive a little bit into hypotheses, and then we'll go into some of the less obvious stuff, as these are often done wrong and are really the foundation of a good study. A hypothesis needs to be more than just a wish and a prayer. It needs to be a specific and defined thing, an effect that you expect to see. It demands a bit of a theoretical background and some applied logic, but we will talk more about that later. Here are some hypotheses that I have been testing recently, hence the video format. But you get the idea. The null hypothesis there suggests that there's no significant difference in performance between video blog posts and written posts in terms of engagement on social media, while the hypothesis suggests the opposite. The goal here is to be able to reject the null and say, yep, creating blog posts in video format performs better than written posts in terms of social media engagement. There's my metric. Notice these are both what statements, not why statements. As you've heard, I'm sure, millions of times before, but it always bears repeating. Correlation does not equal causation. You are looking for correlations in most studies. You can get deeper and deeper with those correlations to understand the true meaning of why, but as with most things in the social sciences and social fields, the whys are very difficult and squishy and hard to pin down. But we can do lots of what research. So let's talk about some of the less obvious stuff. These are 4 items that I've noticed get commonly missed in marketing experiments: theoretical background, power, specifically statistical power, bias, and confounds. It's important to know about these 4 things because they'll help you design much better, more sound studies. First up is the theoretical background. Good studies don't reinvent the wheel. This should be pretty straightforward. They establish an understanding of what has been done in the area, and then they build on top of it. To use Google Scholar's fun little quote there, stand on the shoulders of giants. I love using Google Scholar for doing some of my theoretical research. Not always relevant for marketing. but it is quite helpful if you're digging in to understand a bit more of the psychology behind marketing. So here's a few ideas for establishing a theoretical background for you. First, Google the idea. Marketers love to share their findings. They love to share what they're up to. It may have already been done, and you might be able to find public information on the matter. Second, review your existing internal data to find evidence to support your claims. You may even have enough data in your systems to straight up answer what you were looking for in the first place. Finally, do the scholarly thing and base it on psych research. You'll earn my undying respect, although it is a very slow and dry process. There's plenty of other ways, but the point is just to make sure that you have a theoretical background for why you are running the study and why you think that the hypothesis will hold true. So now let's talk about power. A little less interesting than that, it is statistical power, or in other words, the probability of finding an effect if there is one to be found. This is often misunderstood, but statistical power is very simple. It just represents, it's a metric, and it represents the chance that you will find an effect. A power analysis, which is over my head, and I assume the heads of most of the people watching this, will tell you if your study is strong enough to be statistically significant. Now, this term is bandied about often, and it's very often misunderstood. Statistical significance has a specific meaning, and guess what? It's not business relevance. If you don't already know, statistical significance means the likelihood that an effect is not due to chance. In other words, it can be replicated, and what can be replicated can be scaled. Statistically significant results typically have a p-value of 0.05, which essentially means that you have a 95% confidence that the results can be replicated if you were to do it again. That's a powerful thing, and honestly, it's well worth pursuing. So if you want to be closer to significance, you need one of two things: either a greater effect size, because larger effect sizes are less likely to be due to chance, or more data to support your findings. And that's the old adage, we always need more data. Generally speaking, the only thing that can be controlled is the amount of data in your system. So when you're in doubt, add more test subjects. And just to note, non-significant data is still very useful. We tend to call non-significant findings directional because they point at interesting directions, but don't necessarily imply repeatability. So you might look at directional data and identify a way to go for a future study that you will design specifically to be statistically significant and thus repeatable, or rather the results to be repeatable. So next, let's talk about bias. This is a really interesting concept. Everybody has biases, but there's a lot more going on than just internal bias when you're dealing with study design. You have to be aware of what biases can affect the design of a study so you don't fall into traps that can damage the integrity of your findings and indeed your very data. So here is a list of a handful of the biases that exist within study design. There are more, but these are the ones that really stand out. And honestly, there's way too many of them for this video. I could spend, an entire video going into any one of these. So instead, we're going to jump into just a few that you need to be aware of. And those are selection bias, interviewer bias, chronology bias, and confirmation bias. We'll start with selection bias. As the name suggests, this is about the selection of your sample. It needs to be random. It can be segmented. You might look specifically at mid-market B2B SaaS companies, but it needs to be random within the sample that you're studying, because otherwise your data will wind up suffering from selection bias, which means it's not trustworthy because how you selected the participants may have impacted the outcomes. So if you're not aware of that, if that's not explicitly a goal up front, it's going to mess with your data. And the goal of this is to get sound, great data that you can base good decisions on. Next up is interviewer bias. If you're doing interviews, this is obviously the most relevant. Make sure that your own opinions or expectations do not interfere with your ability to be objective. In other words, and at the very simplest concept, it boils down to treat all participants exactly the same. If you're running surveys, if you're doing interviews, this is going to be important no matter what. Everybody should have access to the same incentives. Everybody should have access to the same questions. Pretty straightforward stuff here. Just don't treat people differently when you're doing a study. It messes up the data. Next up is the chronology bias. If you are sleeping on the theoretical background and you are looking at data that is 5 years old, and since then your entire marketing organization has changed, maybe you've gone through a rebrand, maybe your whole strategy is different, you might not be able to base current present day research on that data. You need to know what has happened in between so you don't wind up behind the times, hence the name. And finally, we have confirmation bias, which this is a pretty common one in discussions nowadays. But if you come into a data set with preconceived notions, looking for a particular effect, there's a possibility that you might see stories in the data that maybe don't hint at a complete analysis. You need to avoid this. Try to look at the data objectively. Don't be afraid of being proven wrong, because as we will see in a few moments here, that is an opportunity to do even more interesting and exciting studies. So don't give in to confirmation bias very easy when you're doing the analysis. The study is done. You just want to see what you were looking for, but don't jump at it if it's not actually there. Finally, we're going to talk about confounds. Now, a confound is something that you didn't expect, that came up, that messes with your ability to state whether or not the hypothesis is true. I have a good example of this. I was running a study in high schools on a particular video game, and how the narrator impacted the choices that the students would make. What we found is that there did appear to be an effect. However, it also correlated the exact same way with video game play experience. That game experience was a confound in that we could not state concretely that what we were seeing, that our hypothesis was true, because it could have also been because of game experience. So if that makes sense to you, great, you're on board with confounds. If not, look it up. There's tons of articles on it. But the point is, confounds can really mess up your study. If you don't anticipate them, they can make it really hard to make concrete statements. However, they also present huge opportunities. We looked into that data, and we started to find all kinds of interesting trends surrounding game experience, and indeed a couple of other factors that we looked at that we wouldn't have noticed were it not for the confounds driving us to dig deeper. So our suggestion here: embrace the confounds. They present some opportunities. Take a look at them deeply, and think about how you might leverage those into something more meaningful. That's all for today. So get researching. I'm excited to see what you all come up with. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. It's just tom@heinzmarketing.com. I am happy to answer it. I love hearing from people who have watched this stuff. Tell me about your studies. Ask me questions. If you want my insight, I'm happy to give it. But yeah, that's it. Thank you for attending, and good luck.